June 6, 1944. Normandy. The world was still wrapped in pre-dawn silence when the first German sentries raised their binoculars toward the sea. What they saw in that fragile darkness was not the familiar emptiness of the English Channel, but a sight so vast, so incomprehensible, that it shook the very foundations of their belief in victory. At first, it seemed like a low fog rolling across the horizon. Then the fog grew teeth, shapes, shadows, the jagged silhouettes of ships upon ships, multiplying until the line of the horizon itself disappeared. The water was gone. The ocean itself seemed replaced by steel. From his observation post at the Crisbecq battery, Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen steadied his Zeiss binoculars against the trembling in his hands. He was 32 years old, a career officer, hardened by years of service in the Kriegsmarine. Yet what he saw through the lenses that morning did not belong to the world he thought he understood. Row after row, vessel after vessel, 7,000 ships stretching farther than the eye could follow. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, freighters, all moving as one colossal armada. He whispered to himself, "Das ist unmöglich." This is impossible. But it was not illusion. It was not trickery. It was the weight of the Allied world bearing down upon Fortress Europe. Behind him, reinforced concrete walls rattled as orders came in over the field telephone. His battery of two 10mm Czech-made Skoda guns was to prepare for engagement. But Ohmsen knew in his heart what the numbers meant. His 4 guns, his crew of determined men, would be drops of water flung against a tidal wave. Still, the order was given. Still, the gunners prepared their shells. At 5:52 a.m., fire control relayed the signal, and at 5:55 the first German artillery roared into the night air, arcing high toward the oncoming armada. Sparks against Titelsert, Hunde, drops against the flood. In that moment, Germany's western defences, 4 years in the making, billions of Reichsmarks in concrete, steel and sweat, faced the test their leaders swore would never come. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's impregnable fortress, bristled with minefields, bunkers and machine guns. But no bunker, no fortress could hold back what was coming. For the first time, German officers on the coast confronted the terrible truth that had been hidden from them, that their enemy's industrial might was not only real, but greater than anything they had dared imagine. And the invasion, the one Hitler claimed could be stopped on the beaches, had already begun. The first shells slammed into the water short of the target. Great white plumes rose skyward, harmless to the massive wall of ships still crawling toward France. For a brief instant, the men inside the Crisbecq battery felt the sting of futility. They reloaded, faster now, the steel ramming against the breach, sweat dripping in the chill dawn. Then came the thunder of return fire. From the horizon, Allied battleships answered. The USS Nevada, scarred from Pearl Harbor but resurrected for vengeance, opened fire. Each shell it hurled was the weight of a small car, crossing the distance in less than half a minute. The German gunners had only a fraction of a second to brace before the world around them tore open. The first blast ripped a crater just outside the battery walls, shaking concrete like paper. Men were thrown to the ground, ears bleeding, faces white with dust. Ohmsen shouted over the roar, his voice drowned in the quake of artillery. "Haltet die Stellung! Fire again!" His men obeyed. They had no choice. Shell after shell clawed into the grey light, reaching for the sea. This was not war as they had known it in 1940, when small units, armoured thrusts and precision broke nations apart in weeks. This was annihilation delivered in industrial waves, the kind of battle no individual could shape, only endure. By 6:15 a.m. the battery was shaking apart. Smoke poured from ventilation shafts, concrete spalled from the ceilings. Still, the Germans fired. The Skoda guns, monsters of steel built decades before, hurled their shells into the advancing swarm, striking near the destroyer USS Corrie. At 6:35, one shell hit true. Corrie shuddered, broke her back, and began to sink. Cheers erupted in the battery, brief and defiant. For the men inside, it meant that even against impossible odds they had drawn blood. But outside, the sea itself seemed endless. Every sinking shot. IP was a pebble thrown into a river. The current did not slow. Landing craft still advanced, row after row, cutting through surf, carrying boys from Kansas, Liverpool, Toronto and Sydney, faces pale, helmets strapped tight, rifles clutched as though they were lifelines. They could not see the Germans yet, only the endless grey shore looming ahead. Some prayed, some vomited from the sea's heave, some stared in silence, already numb. The German defenders inside their bunkers did not know the names of the men approaching. They saw only faceless silhouettes, dark against the surf. Yet the truth was already written in the thunder above them. This was not a battle they could win. It was a battle they could only survive, if survival was even possible. As the first wave of landing craft neared the beaches, the German guns shifted their fire. Machine gunners, hidden in pillboxes of reinforced steel and concrete, waited with fingers trembling on the triggers. They had drilled this moment 1,000 times in training. Now it was real. The horizon was not theory. It was filled with men about to step into their killing zones. At 6:30 a.m., ramps dropped into the surf. Cold seawater rushed in as Allied soldiers splashed forward, boots dragging in sand, rifles lifted above heads. On Omaha, the water turned red within minutes. German MG-42s opened fire with a sound like ripping canvas. 1,200 rounds per minute. Entire squads vanished in sprays of surf. Men stumbled forward only to be cut down before their feet touched the sand. Medics waded in with satchels of morphine and bandages, only to be struck themselves. Chaos devoured order. Officers screamed commands no one could hear. From their bunkers, German defenders fought in a nightmare they could scarcely believe was real. The men who had laughed and smoked hours earlier in the early morning quiet now felt their trigger fingers blister. Ammunition belts ran red hot. Gunners swapped barrels until their palms burned. Still, the tide came. Still, the beach filled with bodies, not retreating, not surrendering, but advancing through fire. At Pointe du Hoc, US Rangers clawed up sheer cliffs with ropes and grappling hooks under a rain of grenades and bullets. Some fell, ropes cut, plunging into the waves below. Others climbed over their bodies, blood slicking the stone, until they reached the top. By 7:08 a.m., the Rangers breached the German defences, silencing the guns that threatened Utah Beach. In the bunkers along Omaha, panic crept in. Ammunition dwindled, smoke filled lungs. A soldier named Carl Fischer, 19 years old, gripped his MG-42 and realized the belt inside. His lap was the last. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen in Dresden, of letters never answered. Then the command came. Haltet die Stellung, hold the line. And so he did, until the barrel clicked dry. The truth was dawning on both sides. For the Allies, that this beach was not a quick crossing, but a slaughterhouse. For the Germans, that their vaunted Atlantic wall was not unbreakable, but crumbling hour by hour under sheer human will and industrial might. And yet, in those early hours, the outcome was far from certain. The sand at Omaha was littered with bodies. Commanders debated pulling men back into the sea. Germany's last hope was that the invasion could be stopped here, at the water's edge. But the tide does not stop for anyone. 20 kilometers inland, inside a commandeered French chateau near Saint-Lô, field telephones rang without pause. Reports came in faster than they could be written down. Enemy landings at Utah. Omaha under assault. Pointe du Hoc breached. Sword and Juno, thousands coming ashore. Each message carried the same undertone. Disbelief, then panic. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was not at his command post. He was in Germany, visiting his wife and buying her shoes for her birthday. He had argued with Hitler for months that the Atlantic Wall was a myth, a paper tiger that would collapse the moment a real invasion came. Hitler had dismissed him, insisting the Reich could hold the beaches, insisting his Führer's intuition outweighed military logic. Now, as the invasion unfolded, Rommel's warnings were becoming prophecy. In his absence, command fell to others, men less decisive, less daring. General Dolman of the 7th Army hesitated, waiting for confirmation. Was this the real invasion, or merely a feint? For years, German intelligence had been fed lies by Allied spies, whispers that the real blow would fall at Calais, not Normandy. Even now, many officers clung to that illusion, convinced the wall of steel at their doorstep was only a diversion, and so, hour by hour, precious time was lost. Meanwhile, in his wolf's lair hundreds of miles away, Hitler himself was asleep. No one dared wake him. Not until nearly 10 a.m. did he finally rise, irritated, only to be told that the largest amphibious invasion in history had begun without his knowledge. He refused to release the armoured divisions he had hoarded under his direct command. Without them, the men on the beaches fought with dwindling supplies alone against an enemy that multiplied with every passing wave. Inside the German command rooms, maps filled with red arrows told a story no one wanted to read. Reports of Allied paratroopers dropping behind the lines poured in, thousands of them, cutting phone wires, blowing bridges, ambushing convoys. A fortress designed to repel an attack from the sea was being bled from the land as well. Officers argued, voices breaking. "We must counterattack now," one shouted. "9, we wait for the Führer's orders," another insisted. That paralysis sealed their fate. By noon, Allied soldiers were digging into the bluffs above the beaches. Machine guns silenced, bunkers overrun, rangers and infantry clawed out footholds where hours earlier they had drowned in surf. The Atlantic Wall had not crumbled in a single blow. It was breaking piece by piece, bunker by bunker, man by man. And deep inside, the Germans began to realize a darker truth. This was not a battle they could win. It was only the beginning of the end. By midday, the fate of Europe was being written across 5 brutal stretches of sand and surf. Each beach had its own story, its own nightmare. At Utah Beach, things began with chaos. Strong currents had pushed the U.S. 4th Infantry Division nearly 2 kilometers south of their intended landing zone. Officers cursed as maps became useless, landmarks vanished, and men stumbled into the unknown. Yet this mistake saved lives. They had landed where German defences were weaker. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., limping with a cane, waded ashore with pistol drawn, and famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His calm, almost defiant words steadied his men, and within hours Utah became a foothold. But on Omaha Beach, hell itself had broken loose. The defences were stronger, the bluffs higher, the machine guns thicker. Waves of men were slaughtered before they could reach cover. Tanks meant to support the landings sank in the churning surf, victims of faulty seals and enemy fire. By 8 a.m., commanders considered evacuating. "We may have to pull them off," Admiral Alan Kirk muttered, horrified. Yet the men on the sand refused to die for nothing. Small groups of soldiers crawled forward, using craters and corpses for cover, inch by inch up the blood-soaked slope. By noon, against all odds, a handful of breakthroughs began to appear. Omaha was not won in glory, but in agony. At Gold Beach, British troops pressed forward with precision. Their tanks, known as Hobart's funnies, rolled ashore with strange attachments, flails that beat mines, bridges that unfolded over ditches, flamethrowers that belched fire into bunkers. It was innovation born of desperation, and it worked. By early afternoon, gold was secured, and the British pushed inland toward Bayeux. On Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced a storm of artillery and machine gun fire. The first wave, offered nearly 50% casualties. Landing craft burned, men drowned, screams echoed across the tide. But the Canadians refused to yield. By day's end they had advanced farther inland than any other force, cutting into the Norman countryside like a blade. And at Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division stormed ashore with ferocity. French commandos fought beside them, retaking villages once lost to the Reich. By evening they were pushing toward Caen, though fierce German resistance, including tanks of the 21st Panzer Division, slowed their advance. 5 beaches, 5 crucibles, each soaked in blood, each a gamble. And as the sun rose higher, the truth emerged like the tide itself. The Allies were ashore to stay. The Atlantic Wall, built with 4 years of labour and Hitler's iron boast, had been breached in a single day. Yet the price was staggering. By nightfall, the sands of Normandy were littered with the bodies of over 10,000 men. For every metre gained, there had been a man who would never rise again. The invasion had succeeded, but the real war in France was only beginning. While the beaches bled and burned, the real dagger was being driven into Germany's defences from above. In the hours before dawn, Allied paratroopers had dropped into the Norman countryside. The sky had been filled with thousands of parachutes, white blossoms drifting against the moonlight. But the landings were chaos. Strong winds scattered units across miles. Some men drowned in flooded marshes before their boots even touched soil. Others landed directly in enemy fire, cut down as they struggled to free themselves from their harnesses. Yet chaos became advantage. Isolated squads of Americans from the 82nd and 101st Airborne regrouped in the darkness, forming ad hoc bands of fighters. They blew bridges, cut communication lines, and ambushed convoys carrying ammunition to the front. German commanders found their phones dead, their roads blocked, their supply trucks burning. Nothing was where it should be. No order could be trusted. And the panic spread like wildfire. By midday, the long-feared moment of decision had arrived. Unleash the German armoured divisions for a counterattack, or watch the Allies expand their foothold. But Hitler's paranoia had poisoned the chain of command. He had kept the powerful Panzer reserves, the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division, under his personal authority. His generals begged for their release. Strike now while they are still on the sand, they pleaded. But Hitler hesitated. He was convinced the Normandy landings were only a feint, that the real invasion would come at Calais. He delayed hours that would decide the fate of Europe. Instead, smaller German formations attempted desperate counterattacks. At Sword Beach, the 21st Panzer Division rumbled forward, tanks clanking through the hedgerows. For a moment it seemed they might reach the sea, splitting the British line in two, but Allied air power descended. Swarms of Spitfires, Typhoons and Thunderbolts streaked overhead, rockets shrieking into columns of armour. Flames engulfed the fields. Panzer crews scrambled from burning turrets, choking on smoke. The counterattack dissolved before it had begun. Meanwhile, inland, German units stumbled into ambush after ambush. Paratroopers armed with bazookas and gammon bombs turned country roads into killing zones. A squad of the 101st held a key bridge at La Fière against repeated assaults, their ammunition dwindling, their dead lying in heaps around them. But the bridge held. Each failure bought the Allies more time. Each hour that passed meant more men, more tanks, more guns pouring onto the beaches. By the time Hitler finally released the panzer divisions late in the day, it was already too late. The Allies were no longer trapped on narrow strips of sand. They were dug in, reinforced, supplied. The wall had been breached, and all Germany could do now was bleed. As the thunder of war spread across Normandy, it was not only soldiers who paid the price. For the people of France, liberation arrived with fire. In the villages behind the beaches, families huddled in cellars as the ground shook. Children clung to their mothers, their ears ringing from the endless drum of artillery. Walls cracked, windows shattered, fires leapt from house to house. The sky glowed an eerie orange, filled with the scream of aircraft and the roar of naval guns. To the civilians of Normandy, it seemed as though the world itself was tearing apart. Some tried to flee, dragging carts of belongings down narrow lanes, only to find the roads clogged with German convoys or strafed by Allied fighters hunting tanks. Cows and horses lay dead in fields, orchards burned, villages became battlefields. At Carentan, Sainte-Mère-Église, and Caen, ordinary people woke to find themselves living in the centre of the largest invasion in history. One French woman, Marie-Louise Osmond, wrote in her diary that the sky rained fire without end. She watched helplessly as her farm was flattened by bombs meant for German positions. Others, hiding in barns or ditches, saw paratroopers drop from the sky like strange angels of war, their silk canopies drifting through smoke. Some civilians risked everything to help them, guiding lost soldiers through hedgerows, feeding them scraps of bread and water. Others, accused of collaboration, were dragged into the streets by resistance fighters and shot before their neighbours' eyes. Liberation came with vengeance. For the Germans, orders were merciless. Any village suspected of aiding the Allies was to be punished. Barns were torched, hostages shot. In Caen, civilians who dared wave to Allied soldiers were gunned down. In Tilly-sur-Seulles, whole neighbourhoods vanished under barrages of artillery, caught in the crossfire of tank battles. The liberation and destruction became indistinguishable. By nightfall on June the 6th, Normandy's fields were littered with the dead of every uniform: German grey, American green, British khaki, Canadian brown. But among them lay thousands without uniforms at all: farmers, shopkeepers, children who had simply been born in the wrong place, on the wrong day. For years they had lived under the shadow of Nazi occupation, waiting for freedom. Now freedom had come, but at a price few could have imagined. For them, D-Day was not only the beginning of liberation. It was also the day their homeland became a graveyard. By the morning of June the 7th, the beaches were no longer the battlefield. They were cemeteries. Wounded men groaned in the surf, medics scrambled between piles of the dead, and chaplains knelt over bodies, whispering last rites drowned by the crash of waves. Yet behind them, the sand filled with endless supplies: crates of ammunition, fuel drums, jeeps, artillery, and wave after wave of reinforcements. The beachheads had held. The Atlantic wall was broken. But the war in Normandy was only beginning. The Allies had to push inland into a landscape unlike anything they had trained for. Normandy was a maze of hedgerows, thick earthen embankments topped with centuries-old trees, forming green walls around every field. Each hedge was a fortress. Each lane was a choke point. For tanks and infantry alike, it was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. German defenders, seasoned and fanatical, turned the countryside into a web of ambushes. A single machine gun, hidden behind a hedgerow, could pin down an entire company. Snipers lurked in barns and church steeples. Mines and booby traps turned every step into a gamble with death. The 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division, made up of teenagers indoctrinated since childhood, threw itself into counterattacks with fanatic fury. They fought not like soldiers but like zealots, swearing loyalty to Hitler with every charge. In one brutal engagement near Caen, Canadian prisoners were captured and executed, their bodies left sprawled in fields as warnings. This was not war by rules, it was annihilation without restraint. For the Allies, progress was measured in yards, not miles. A single hedgerow might take hours, even days, to capture. The men who had survived Omaha and Juno now faced an enemy more hidden, more patient, more merciless. Casualties mounted. Villages like Saint-Lô, once quiet farming towns, became ruins, walls reduced to Caen, a medieval city of stone churches, narrow streets, and quiet squares. Before the war, a place of study and trade. By June 1944 it had become a fortress. Hitler had ordered it held at all costs, and the SS obeyed with fanatical devotion. The city was the gateway to the French interior. If the Allies broke through here, they could pour into open country and drive toward Paris. If they failed, the invasion might stall in the hedgerows forever. The first attempts to take Caen began just days after D-Day. British and Canadian forces pushed south, advancing under constant fire. But every approach was a death trap. The 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division and elements of the Panzerlehr fought with ruthless skill. Tanks lurked behind rubble. Snipers watched from windows. Machine guns raked every street. For every block gained, dozens of men fell. On June the 7th, the Allies believed they could capture Caen in a single day. Instead, it took over a month. The fighting was unlike anything seen on the beaches. Here, war was close and personal. Streets became killing grounds. Houses collapsed under shell fire. The cathedral bells that once marked the passing of hours were silent, replaced by the endless rattle of machine guns and the shriek of artillery. Civilians trapped inside their homes dug graves in their gardens, burying neighbours and children beneath rosebushes, while battles raged in the streets outside. The Allies unleashed their air power, reducing entire districts to rubble. On July 7th, 1,000 heavy bombers dropped over 2,500 tons of explosives on the city. The ground trembled as Caen was swallowed in flame. Yet even in the ruins, the SS held on. Tanks fought among shattered houses. Soldiers fired from cellars and basements, from piles of collapsed stone. The city became a graveyard of both flesh and architecture, every wall hiding death. For the men on the ground, the battle for Caen was a nightmare of repetition. Advance a few yards, be driven back, try again. Canadian infantry nicknamed it the meat grinder. German soldiers, cut off and running low on supplies, fought with savage desperation. The Allies, for all their strength, paid in blood for every street. By mid-July, Caen was finally in Allied hands, or rather what was left of it. 90% of the city lay in ruins. Tens of thousands of civilians were dead or homeless. For the Allies, it was a victory bought at staggering cost. For the Germans, it was proof of their own slow death. And beyond Caen, the road to Paris began to open. By late July 1944, the Allies were still trapped in the killing fields of Normandy. Weeks of combat had gained them only a few miles. The beaches were secure, but the hedgerows had swallowed thousands of lives. Caen lay in ruins, but the German line still held. The men at the front began to whisper. Had they traded one stalemate for another? Then came Operation Cobra. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Instead of grinding forward hedge by hedge, the Americans would unleash the full fury of their air power against a narrow section of the German line near Saint-Lô. Once the defences were obliterated, armoured divisions would surge through the gap and pour into open countryside. If it worked, the deadlock would shatter. If it failed, Normandy would remain a graveyard of attrition. On July the 25th, the sky darkened with the largest carpet bombing of the war. Nearly 3,000 Allied aircraft thundered overhead, dropping more than 4,000 tons of explosives onto a strip of German positions. The earth convulsed. Fields, trees, and men alike were vaporized. Survivors described the landscape afterward as lunar, nothing but blackened craters stretching for miles. But the bombing was not without tragedy. Some aircraft released too early, and American infantry waiting to advance were caught in their own firestorm. Entire companies were obliterated in minutes. General Omar Bradley, watching the carnage, was said to have turned pale. Yet, despite the horror, the plan succeeded. German defences disintegrated. Shell-shocked survivors stumbled through the dust, unable to form a coherent defence. Into that chaos surged General Patton's newly unleashed Third Army. Tanks roared forward, no longer crawling through hedgerows but racing across open fields. After weeks of suffocation, the battlefield cracked wide open. The Americans advanced 20 miles in 2 days, then 40, then 70. German units, starved of fuel and hammered from the air, collapsed into retreat. Entire divisions disintegrated under the speed of the assault. The breakout was so sudden, so overwhelming, that the German command could scarcely comprehend it. Hitler, enraged, ordered a counterattack with his last reserves of armour. The result was catastrophe. The Allies encircled tens of thousands of German troops in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Bombed from the air, shelled from the ground, the German Seventh Army was annihilated in fields littered with burning tanks and corpses. Survivors who escaped described it as der Kessel von Falaise, the cauldron of Falaise. Normandy, once thought to be Germany's shield, had become its grave. And with the breakout, the road to Paris lay wide open. By August 1944, the German front in Normandy was collapsing. What had begun as a cautious crawl through hedgerows had become a torrent of steel rushing eastward. Villages once soaked in blood were now behind the advancing tide. Bridges, roads and fields swarmed with Allied convoys, their engines roaring toward one goal: Paris. The City of Light had endured 4 years of occupation. 4 years of German boots on cobblestones, of ration lines and curfews, of resistance fighters executed in hidden cellars. The swastika flew over the Eiffel Tower. Every café, every metro station, every boulevard carried the weight of humiliation and fear. Yet beneath the surface, Paris simmered. The resistance grew bolder as the Allies drew near, waiting for the signal to rise. That moment came in mid-August. Railway workers, policemen, and ordinary citizens seized weapons and barricaded the streets. Gunfire rattled through the Latin Quarter. Trains were derailed. Telephone lines were cut. German patrols found themselves ambushed at intersections by men and women who had lived in silence too long. Paris was burning with defiance before the Allies even arrived. Hitler's orders were clear: Paris must not fall intact. If the city could not be held, it was to be destroyed, its bridges blown, its monuments reduced to rubble. But General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German commander, hesitated. He had seen the futility of Normandy. He knew the war was lost. And unlike others, he could not bring himself to obliterate one of the world's great cities. His disobedience, in the end, saved Paris. On August 25, 1944, the French 2nd Armoured Division, led by General Leclerc, fought its way into the city alongside American forces. Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags hidden since 1940, embracing soldiers, showering them with flowers, wine, and tears. Church bells rang across the skyline, bells silenced for 4 long years. Charles de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, declaring, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." The swastika was torn down from the Eiffel Tower. The city that had been suffocated now breathed free again. For the Allies, the liberation of Paris was more than a victory. It was a symbol, proof that tyranny could be beaten back, that nations could rise from ashes, that the sacrifices of D-Day and Normandy had not been in vain. The war was far from over. Ahead lay the Rhine, the Ardennes, and finally Berlin itself. But on that summer day in 1944, the world saw that freedom had returned to the heart of Europe. Paris lived again.